Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases in American history. Before we start, comment below where you are watching us right now, because the story we're going to unravel today took place more than a century ago in the dark mountains of North Carolina. And to this day, no one has been able to fully explain what really happened to Nathaniel Burke. We are in the year 1911. The Appalachian Mountains region was still a territory where modern civilization had barely arrived. Dirt roads meandered between deep valleys and peaks covered in dense mist. North Carolina at that time was a place where entire communities lived isolated for weeks, where the silence of the forests hid secrets that would never reach the newspapers of the big cities. It was a world apart, governed by its own unwritten rules. Nathaniel Burke was 32 years old when he decided to leave his life in Richmond, Virginia, to explore the mountains to the south. He was a cartographer by trade, hired by a railroad company that planned to expand its lines through Appalachia. An educated, meticulous man who kept a detailed diary of his expeditions. His records were accurate, almost scientific. He wrote down everything: temperatures, rock formations, encounters with locals, every stream he crossed. That habit, ironically, would be the only reason we now know that something terribly wrong happened in those mountains. In March of that year, Nathaniel departed Asheville with provisions for 3 weeks. Their destination was Madison County, specifically a remote area near the community of Shelton Laurel, known for its deep caves and treacherous canyons. He intended to map possible routes for the railroad, identify natural tunnels, assess the stability of the terrain. It was lonely work, but Nathaniel preferred it that way. He had hired only one local guide, a man named Ezra Whitlock, who knew each trail in that region like the back of his hand. The first few days passed normally, according to Nathaniel's diary. He described the cold March weather, the trees still without full leaves, the constant sound of water rushing through the canyons. Ezra was a competent guide, although not very communicative. On the 5th day, they found an abandoned hut on top of a hill. Nathaniel noted that the place seemed to have been left in a hurry. There were utensils scattered around, a pot still on the stove, hanging clothes that were already rotting with the humidity. Ezra didn't want to go in. He only said that that place had bad stories and that they should move on. But Nathaniel was a man of science. Curiosity was part of his nature. He explored the cabin while Ezra waited outside, visibly annoyed. In the diary, Nathaniel mentions finding strange markings on the interior walls, something he described as primitive symbols etched deep into the wood, forming patterns that I cannot decipher. He made sketches of these symbols in his notebook. He also mentioned finding a compartment hidden under the floorboards, but did not detail what was inside. He only wrote, "I have discovered something that Ezra needs to see. I believe that this hut was not simply abandoned." From that point on, the tone of the diary changes. Nathaniel's notes become briefer, almost rushed. On the 6th day, he writes that Ezra is acting strangely, constantly looking back during the walks, insisting that they should come down from the mountains immediately. Nathaniel argued that he still had work to do, that the company expected results. Ezra would have answered something that Nathaniel recorded in quotation marks. "There are things in these mountains that maps cannot show, and places where sensible men do not go." On the 7th day, something happened. The record is confusing, fragmented. Nathaniel writes of having heard sounds during the previous night, which he describes as voices coming from the valley below, but they were not normal voices. They had an unnatural echo, as if they came from within the land itself. By morning, Ezra had disappeared. His things were still in the camp, including his rifle and groceries, but he just wasn't there anymore. Nathaniel spent the day searching, calling, following trails around the camp. Nothing, as if Ezra had been swallowed by the forest. Alone now, Nathaniel made a fateful decision. Instead of immediately going downstairs to get help, he decided to keep going. We don't know if it was professional stubbornness, fear of abandoning a man who might be hurt somewhere, or something more obscure that the diary doesn't clearly reveal, but he pressed on, into even more remote areas of Appalachia. His notes from the following days speak of a growing sense of being watched, of finding footprints that made no sense, of hearing sounds he could not identify. On the 10th day, Nathaniel found another structure. It was not a hut, but something he describes as a kind of stone shrine built against the face of a cliff, partially hidden by vegetation. Inside, he found disturbing objects that he lists in visibly shaky handwriting. Bones arranged in circular patterns, stones stained with something dark, and more of those symbols engraved, now not just on wood, but carved directly into the rock. Nathaniel was beginning to understand that he had stumbled upon something far beyond a simple mapping expedition. The last complete diary entry is dated March 23, 1911. Nathaniel writes that he has finally decided to return, that he needs to report what he found to the authorities, that something terrible has happened in these mountains and may still be happening. He mentions having kept evidence, small objects that he collected from the stone shrine. He plans to go down the next morning, following a stream until he finds the main road. And then the entrance ends abruptly with an unsettling sentence. I hear footsteps outside my tent. They are not from animals. Nathaniel Burke's diary was found 6 weeks later by a fur trapper named Thomas Hargrove, who was following deer trails in nearby Madison County. Thomas was checking his traps when he noticed something unusual, pieces of torn fabric stuck in thorny bushes, forming a jagged trail that descended toward a narrow valley. Curious and also slightly alarmed, he followed the tracks until he found a leather backpack, half buried under damp leaves and fallen branches. Inside was the diary, along with some measuring instruments, a partially completed map, and a small canvas bag containing objects that Thomas would later describe to the sheriff as strange things that made no sense at all to be there. When Thomas took the diary to the town of Marshall, the seat of Madison County, local authorities initially treated the case as a simple exploration accident. After all, men from the city who ventured alone into those mountains disappeared with some frequency. Appalachian did not forgive mistakes. One misstep could mean a deadly fall into a canyon. An unexpected storm could disorient even the most experienced explorers. Black bears were still common in the region. The simplest explanation was usually the correct one. But Sheriff Edmund Calloway, a man who had already served as a federal marshal before retiring to that quiet county, was not satisfied with simple explanations. He read the entire diary, page by page, and what he found there bothered him deeply. It wasn't the technical notes on topography or railroad routes that caught his eye, but rather the last entries, the ones that spoke of abandoned huts, strange symbols, and hidden stone structures. Edmund knew the mountains. He had grown up there, and he also knew the stories that his elders told in low voices, stories that most people preferred to ignore. Edmund organized a search expedition with 12 men, including Thomas Hargrove, to guide them to the place where the backpack was found. They set out on a foggy morning in May, when spring had already blanketed the mountains with dense foliage. It took the group 3 days just to reach the general area indicated in Nathaniel's journal. The trails were treacherous, often disappearing completely under the vegetation. More than once men considered giving up and coming back, but Edmund insisted. Something in that diary disturbed him in a way he couldn't fully explain. On the 4th day of the search, they found the first definitive sign of Nathaniel Burke. It was a partially dismantled camp in a small clearing, surrounded by dense pine trees. The tent was still there, torn in several places, the stakes torn from the ground as if something had pulled hard. Kitchen utensils were scattered within a radius of several meters. Nathaniel's rifle was propped up against a tree, loaded but never fired. His extra clothes were soaked by weeks' rain, partially covered in moss, but there was no body, no sign of blood, no clear evidence of fighting, just that scene of sudden chaos. The men searched the area around the camp. One of them, a farmer named William Jessup, found something disturbing about 50 yards from the site. Footprints, but they were not normal footprints. William called Edmund and the others to see. The marks on the wet soil looked human in basic shape, but they were too large, disproportionate, and the depth of the impressions suggested a weight far greater than that of an ordinary person. Even worse, the footprints seemed to circle the camp several times, as if something had observed for hours before taking action. Edmund ordered them to follow the footprints. The trail of marks led them down the mountain, through an ever-thickening forest, until they reached a narrow canyon where a stream ran between lichen-covered rocks. And it was there, in a bend in the creek, where the water formed a small dark well, that they found Nathaniel's second piece of equipment, his tool belt, still with all the instruments attached, but the leather was torn, as if it had been torn by force. One of the men on the expedition, James Porter, who had served in the war against Spain years earlier, examined the belt and quietly declared that this kind of damage was not caused by wild animals or accidents. It was something deliberate, something with considerable force. Edmund made a decision. Half of the group was to return to Marshall and bring more men, supplies, and, if possible, an experienced tracker from outside the region. The other half, including himself, would continue to search. There was something in those mountains that needed to be found, and each hour that passed diminished their chances of understanding what had really happened to Nathaniel Burke, and presumably to Ezra Whitlock as well. The men agreed, though several of them clearly preferred to go down altogether. There was a sensation in the air, a tension that no one could properly name, but that everyone felt. As 6 men descended back into civilization, Edmund and the other 5 continued the search. They followed the stream upstream, for Nathaniel's journal mentioned having camped near running water on several occasions. As they advanced, the landscape became more rugged, wilder. The trees were older there, some with trunks so wide that 3 men couldn't hug them hand in hand. Sunlight barely penetrated through the thick canopy of leaves. The sound of the stream echoed strangely between the rocky walls of the valley, creating a cacophony of watery murmurs that seemed to come from all directions at once. It was Thomas Hargrove, the hunter who had found the original backpack, who spotted it first. He stopped abruptly on the trail, raised his hand for silence, and pointed upwards to the face of a cliff that rose almost vertically to their right. It took a few seconds for the others to see what he had noticed. Partially hidden by vines and shrubs that grew from the cracks in the rock, there was a structure. It was not natural. Stones had been piled up deliberately, forming a kind of low wall against the cliff face. It was just as Nathaniel had described in his diary, the stone shrine. Getting there was not easy. The men had to climb using exposed roots and rocky ledges, risking falls that could be fatal. But Edmund was determined. When they finally reached the structure, everyone was silent for a long moment. The place was small, perhaps 3 meters wide by 2 meters deep, forming a kind of artificial cave against the solid rock. And inside, just as Nathaniel had recorded, were the bones arranged in circular patterns. They were not human bones, that was clear immediately. They were from different animals, deer, bears, something that seemed to be from a big cat. But the way they were arranged was anything but natural. Someone or something had created it with purpose. The walls of the cave were covered with symbols. They were not symbols of any native tribe that Edmund knew, and he had lived all his life in that region, interacting with the few Cherokee who still remained in the mountains. These were different, older perhaps, or completely invented. Straight lines and curves intertwined, forming patterns that seemed to mean something, but remained unintelligible. One of the men, a Methodist minister named the Reverend Samuel Yates, murmured a prayer in a low voice when he saw the symbols. He said that it had the mark of something profane, something that should not exist in Christian lands. In the center of the grotto, half buried under a thin layer of dirt and dry leaves, Edmund found something that made his blood run cold. It was a small book, bound in dark leather, with pages yellowed by moisture. It was not Nathaniel's diary that was already in his possession. This one was different, much older. The pages were filled with irregular, tight, almost frenetic handwriting. The text was in English, but the spelling was archaic, suggesting that the book had been written decades earlier, perhaps even in the previous century. Edmund flipped through the pages carefully, trying to decipher the contents in the dim light that entered the grotto. What he read there was never completely revealed to the public. Edmund kept the book in his possession and only shared fragments with some state officials weeks later. But those who were with him at the time, the 5 men who witnessed his expression change page after page, all reported the same thing later. The sheriff was visibly distraught. His hands began to shake slightly. He closed the book abruptly, put it away in his own backpack, and ordered everyone to get down immediately. He offered no explanation. He only said that they needed to get out of that place before nightfall, but they couldn't. The downhill climb was dangerous even in daylight, and the sun was already beginning to set between the mountain peaks. Edmund made the decision to camp right there at the base of the cliff near the stream. The men set up 2 tents, lit a large fire, and took turns watching during the night. No one slept well. Reverend Yates spent hours reading his Bible by the light of the campfire, moving his lips in silent prayer. Thomas Hargrove kept his rifle always within reach, his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the circle of light. And Edmund simply sat there, staring at the flames, occasionally touching the backpack where he had kept the mysterious book. About 3 o'clock in the morning, William Jessup, who was on watch, woke everyone up with an urgent whisper. He had heard something. He couldn't describe exactly what, but they were sounds coming from the direction of the stone shrine above them. Passos, perhaps, or something being dragged over the rocks. The men were in absolute silence, barely daring to breathe, trying to discern any sound but the constant murmur of the stream and the crackling of the fire. And then they listened. It was distant, stuffy, but there was definitely something moving up there. Something heavy, which caused small avalanches of boulders that rolled down the canyon. Edmund took his flashlight and directed it up to the cliff. The beam of light barely reached the height where the shrine was located, but for a brief moment, everyone swore they had seen something. One way. A silhouette that wasn't clearly defined, but that was definitely there, standing on the edge of the stone structure, watching them. And then, too fast to be natural, the form disappeared. It simply moved backwards into the shadows of the cave, and there was no sound. The silence that followed was somehow more terrifying than the previous sounds. No one went back to sleep that night. The men fed the fire until it burned with an almost painful intensity, keeping a large circle of light around the camp. They talked in low voices, sharing stories they had heard over the years about those mountains. Stories of travelers who disappeared without a trace. Of entire communities that were abandoned from one moment to the next, leaving houses full of belongings behind. Of inexplicable sounds echoing through the valleys during moonless nights. Stories that had always been treated as ignorant superstition, tales to scare children. But there that night, under that cliff, none of those stories seemed so absurd. When the sun finally rose, bringing the morning mist that always covered the valleys of Appalachia, the men descended in almost desperate haste. There was no further talk of continuing the search. Everyone silently agreed that they needed to get out of that place. Edmund led the way, marching at a pace that left little room for rest. It took them 2 days to return to Marshall, half the time they had taken on the way up. When they arrived in town, dirty, exhausted, and visibly shaken, they found the party that had come down earlier waiting for them, accompanied by 15 other volunteer men and even a reporter from the Asheville newspaper who had heard about the mysterious case of the missing cartographer. Edmund refused to speak to the reporter immediately. First, he went straight to the office of the county judge, Albert Morrison, a respected man who also served as the region's highest legal authority. Edmund spent 3 hours locked in with the judge, just the two of them. No one knows exactly what was discussed in that meeting, but when they left, Judge Morrison seemed as distraught as Edmund. He called an emergency meeting with community leaders, the mayor, the lead pastor, the local doctor, and some influential landowners. The meeting took place that same evening, behind closed doors, in the county courthouse. What transpired from that meeting was an official decision. A new expedition would be organized, but this time with state authorization, adequate resources, and trained men. It would not be a simple search for a missing explorer. It would be a thorough investigation of that area of the mountains. Judge Morrison personally drafted a telegram to North Carolina Governor William Kitchen, describing the situation in carefully chosen terms. He mentioned the disappearance of 2 men, the disturbing discoveries, the need to understand what was happening in that remote region. The telegram was sent that same evening. The governor's response arrived 3 days later. He authorized the expedition and would send a contingent of 10 men from the state militia to assist, as well as a special investigator from Raleigh, the capital. This investigator was a man named Henry Blackwood, who had made a name for himself solving complex cases involving disappearances and crimes in rural areas. Henry arrived in Marshall on June 12, 111, bringing with him modern equipment for the time, cameras, forensic measuring instruments, even a primitive sound recording device that he hoped to use to document testimony. Henry Blackwood was methodical. Before going up to the mountains, he spent a whole week interviewing everyone involved. He spoke to Thomas Hargrove about how and where he found Nathaniel's backpack. He interrogated Edmund Calloway extensively about everything he had seen and found. He read Nathaniel's diary page by page, making detailed notes. And he also asked to see the mysterious book that Edmund had found in the stone shrine. Edmund hesitated, but eventually delivered. Henry took the book to his room at the local boarding house and spent 2 nights studying it by lamplight. When Henry finally revealed his preliminary conclusions, they were both enlightening and disturbing. The ancient book, according to his analysis, appeared to be a type of diary or record kept by a group that had inhabited those mountains decades earlier, possibly in the early 19th century. The writings were fragmentary, often incoherent, but described rituals, practices, and beliefs that did not correspond to any known religion or tradition. Henry used the word cult in his report. An isolated cult, that had established itself in the depths of Appalachia, away from the eyes of civilized society, practicing things that he preferred not to fully detail in his official documents. But the most disturbing thing about Henry Blackwood's analysis was not in the content of the old book itself, but in the last pages. Someone had made additional notes there, using a different, much newer ink. The handwriting was hurried, almost desperate, and the dates corresponded to the last days recorded in Nathaniel Burke's diary. Henry was able to decipher a few sentences. They're still here. The symbols are warnings, not decorations. Ezra knew. That's why he ran away. And the most disturbing of all, they're not stories, they're records. The last note, made apparently with a trembling hand, said only, "If anyone finds this, do not go up at night." It was Nathaniel's handwriting. Henry presented his findings to Judge Morrison and Sheriff Calloway in a private meeting. He proposed a theory that, although rational, was not without deeply disquieting. According to Henry, there was evidence that an isolated group, possibly descendants or continuators of that ancient cult, still inhabited the most remote regions of those mountains. They would have developed a culture of their own over generations, completely separate from modern civilization. The abandoned hut that Nathaniel found, the stone shrine, the engraved symbols, all indicated a secret community that deliberately kept itself hidden. As for the fate of Nathaniel Burke and Ezra Whitlock, Henry admitted that he could only speculate. Ezra, being local and possibly knowledgeable in ancient stories, may have realized the danger and fled when Nathaniel began exploring places that were supposed to remain untouched. Or perhaps he himself had some connection to those who inhabited the mountains, serving as a kind of guardian who discouraged curious outsiders. As for Nathaniel, Henry believed that he had stumbled upon something that this secret community considered sacred or forbidden. What happened next, whether he was captured, killed, or simply lost trying to escape, remained a mystery. The final expedition was organized for the beginning of July. 25 men in all, the 10 of the state militia, Edmund Calloway and 5 local volunteers, Henry Blackwood and his 2 assistants, plus 7 porters hired to carry equipment and supplies. It was the largest search operation ever carried out in that region of North Carolina. They brought enough tents for 2 weeks, rations, weapons, climbing equipment, photographic material, and even explosives in case they needed to fight their way through areas blocked by landslides or overly dense vegetation. The expedition set out on the 6th of July 1911 on a clear, warm morning. Half of Marshall's population came out to see them go, some hoping they would finally get answers, others with a quiet apprehension that manifested itself in worried looks and murmured blessings. An elderly lady, known locally as Mother Thornton, is said to have approached Henry Blackwood before departure and whispered in his ear, "The mountains hold what the mountains take. You won't find what you're looking for, but you'll find something." Henry wrote this down in his notebook, treating it as interesting local superstition, without giving too much weight to the words. The first 5 days passed without significant incidents. The party followed the routes that Edmund and the others had previously traveled, arriving first at the site of Nathaniel's destroyed camp, then at the gorge where the tool belt was found. Henry photographed everything meticulously, measured distances, collected soil and fabric samples. He was building a complete dossier, something that could be presented to state authorities as solid evidence. The militia established a fortified base camp near the creek, with guards stationed in 4-hour shifts and campfires kept burning throughout the night. On the 6th day they reached the cliff with the stone shrine. This time with more men and adequate equipment, the climb was safer. Henry went upstairs accompanied by Edmund and 3 militia soldiers. The shrine remained exactly as they had left it weeks before. The bones were still arranged in their circular patterns. The symbols on the walls had not been touched, but there was something new. In the center of the grotto, where Edmund had found the ancient book, there was now another object. It was Nathaniel's sketchbook, the one where he had drawn the symbols he had seen in the first abandoned hut. The notebook was open on a specific page, deliberately positioned to be viewed, and on the design of the symbols, someone had written with charcoal a message in plain English, "Go away." The discovery caused immediate debate among men. Some argued that this proved that there were people alive in those mountains, people who watched them, who knew of their presence and who wanted to scare them. Others, more nervous, suggested that they should heed the warning and get off immediately. Henry, keeping a cool head, analyzed the handwriting. It was different from Nathaniel's more primitive handwriting, formed by someone who clearly had little practice with writing. This reinforced his theory of an isolated community. He decided that they would continue, but with extra precautions. Night guards were increased from 2 to 4 men per shift, and all were instructed to keep their weapons loaded and ready. That night, established again at the base of the cliff, nothing happened. No strange sounds, no movements in the shadows. The silence was almost oppressive in its normality. The men began to relax slightly, some even joking that perhaps the warning had worked the other way around, scaring whoever had left it. But Edmund was not convinced. He knew those mountains well enough to know that absolute silence was rarely a good sign. When nocturnal animals were completely silent, it was usually because something bigger, something dangerous, was nearby. On the 7th day, Henry divided the group. Half would remain at base camp, maintaining a safe and defendable position. The other half, including himself, Edmund, and the more experienced militia soldiers, would make an exploration in growing circles around the area, looking for more structures, signs of habitation, or any clues to the whereabouts of Nathaniel and Ezra. They would always follow in groups of at least 5 men, never straying so far that they could not hear the signal shots in case something happened. It was the group led by Edmund that made the most significant discovery. About 2 miles from base camp, following an almost invisible hunting trail that wound through a particularly dense forest, they found clear signs of recent human habitation. It was not a cabin or permanent structure, but a series of temporary shelters built from branches, leaves, and bark, cleverly camouflaged to blend in with their surroundings. There were remains of old fires, boiled animal bones, even some primitive utensils made of stone and wood. Someone had been there, and it wasn't that long ago. Edmund examined the shelters carefully. He estimated that they could accommodate perhaps 10 to 15 people. But the most disturbing thing was the layout of the place. The shelters formed a semicircle, all facing the same spot. A large flat rock in the center of the clearing, stained with something dark that might be ancient blood, though it was impossible to be sure without proper analysis. Around the rock, more of those symbols were engraved on the ground, formed by small white stones carefully arranged. One of the soldiers, a 23-year-old named Robert Lee, the son of a Civil War veteran, found something hidden under a pile of leaves near one of the shelters. It was a torn piece of fabric, already discolored from exposure to time and humidity, but still recognizable. Edmund examined him and felt his stomach tighten. It was the same material as the shirt Nathaniel Burke wore when he left Asheville, according to the description provided by the railroad company that had hired him. A sturdy cotton fabric, in a specific shade of navy blue that was popular with professionals working outdoors. There was no doubt. Edmund ordered everyone to look for more evidence in that area. The men spread out across the clearing, examining every shelter, every corner where something might be hidden, and they found more. Additional fragments of clothing, a brass button that could have come from Nathaniel's waistcoat, and something even more telling, one of the measuring tools on the cartographer's equipment list, a small pocket theodolite used to measure angles. It was damaged, the lens cracked, but it was unmistakably a professional surveyor's tool. Nathaniel had been there, in that place, sometime between his last diary entry and the present, but there was no body, nor human bones, nor any definitive sign of death, just these sparse fragments of belongings, scattered as if they had been deliberately left behind or discarded. Henry Blackwood, when he arrived at the scene 2 hours later after being called by signal shots, stood there in silence for long minutes, just watching, trying to mentally reconstruct what might have happened. His preliminary conclusion was disturbing. This place had served as some kind of judgment or ritual place, and Nathaniel Burke had been brought there against his will. Henry ordered the site to be photographed extensively, every shelter, every symbol, every object found. He intended to document everything with scientific precision to create a record that could not be challenged or dismissed as the imagination of superstitious men. While his main assistant, a meticulous man named Frederick Walsh, worked with the camera, Henry went around the clearing making measurements, notes, sketches. He was a man of logic, trained to find rational explanations, but even he couldn't deny the growing sense that they had stumbled upon something far beyond a simple crime. That evening, back at base camp, Henry called a meeting with all the men on the expedition. He presented the day's findings, showed the photographs that had already been developed using a small portable dark tent, displayed the fragments of clothing and the measuring tool. Then, he asked a direct question. Did anyone there know of isolated communities in these mountains? Had anyone heard specific stories about groups living completely separate from civilization? The local men exchanged uncomfortable looks. No one wanted to be the first to speak. It was Reverend Yates who finally broke the silence. He told a story that his own grandfather had told him decades earlier, about a group of people who had settled in those mountains even before the War of Independence. They were not natives, but they were not ordinary settlers either. They were, according to history, religious refugees from Europe, people who had fled persecution and were looking for a place where they could practice their beliefs without interference. But his beliefs, the Reverend's grandfather said, were not Christian. They were something much older, much darker. And as the generations passed, isolated from the outside world, these people would have become something different, something that was no longer completely human in behavior and custom. Other local men confirmed that they had heard similar versions of that story. Some attributed it to Europeans, others to descendants of settlers who had gone mad with isolation. There were variations, but the core remained the same. There was or had been a group deep in Appalachia that deliberately avoided contact with the outside world, and that reacted violently when their privacy was invaded. Most of the inhabitants of the region simply avoided certain areas of the mountains, respecting invisible borders that had been passed down from generation to generation through veiled advice and warnings. Henry listened attentively, making notes in his notebook. When everyone was done, he remained silent for a moment, organizing his thoughts. Then he made a statement that surprised many present. He believed that stories had a foundation in reality. There was enough evidence to conclude that some human group inhabited those mountains permanently or semi-permanently. But he also believed that this group was made up of flesh and blood people, not ghosts or demons. And if they were people, they could be found, confronted, and if necessary, brought to justice for any crime they had committed. The expedition would continue. However, Henry established new rules. No one would stray from the main group in less than 8 men. Everyone would be armed at all times. Signal fires would be kept at strategic points for guidance in case someone got lost. And, more importantly, they would not remain in the region after dark unless absolutely necessary. Each day after completing their exploration, they would return to base camp before dusk. It was a military protocol adapted to the circumstances, and everyone agreed that it made sense. Over the next few days, the expedition systematically mapped an area of approximately 15 square kilometers around the base camp. They found 3 more sets of temporary shelters, all abandoned but clearly used in recent months. They discovered nearly invisible trails that connected these locations, forming a network of paths that someone who knew the area well could use to move quickly and unseen. They also located 2 natural caves that showed signs of human occupation, ashes from ancient campfires, tool marks on the walls, even some primitive drawings that resembled prehistoric rock art, but were clearly much more recent. In one of these caves, the deepest and darkest of the 2, they found something that made several men instinctively retreat. Hanging from stalactites near the entrance were animal skulls, dozens of them, deer, bears, coyotes, even some that appeared to be domestic animals like goats or pigs. All had been meticulously cleaned, bleached by time, and were strung with vegetable fibers in arrangements that formed a kind of macabre curtain. They clearly served as a warning or territorial demarcation. A non-verbal message, but perfectly understandable. This belongs to someone, stay away. Henry photographed the skulls extensively. He also ventured deeper into the cave, accompanied by Edmund and 4 soldiers carrying lanterns and torches. The cave stretched for perhaps 50 meters, gradually descending, the ceiling getting lower and lower, until it was necessary to bend to continue. And then, at the deepest point, they found a space that had been deliberately modified. The floor was level, the walls had been smoothed with tools, and there was a raised platform built of flat stones stacked together. On the platform, more engraved symbols, and around it, concentric circles of small white stones, identical to those they had seen in the clearing of the shelters. But what drew the most attention was what was in the center of the platform. It was an object wrapped in tanned leather, tied with tendon ropes. Henry hesitated before touching it. There was something deeply wrong with that scene, something that challenged his rational confidence. But he was an investigator, and investigators needed to investigate. Carefully, he cut the ropes with his knife and unfolded the hide. Inside were bones, human bones. Not a complete skeleton, but specific parts. A skull, both hands complete with all the small bones still connected, and what appeared to be a sternum. The bones were clean, bleached, treated with some kind of substance that made them look almost polished. Edmund blessed himself. The soldiers retreated a few steps. Henry remained on his knees, examining the bones with his flashlight. He was not a doctor, but he had seen enough human bones in his work to recognize certain characteristics. The skull was that of an adult, possibly male, based on the robust structure. There was an old fracture on the right side of the skull, which had healed long before death, and there was something else. Engraved directly into the front bone, using some fine and precise tool, was one of the symbols they had seen over and over again. The same pattern of intertwined lines permanently marked on the bone itself. Henry wrapped the bones again with extreme care and decided to take them back to base camp. This was crucial evidence, possibly the most concrete proof they had found that serious crimes were being committed in those mountains. But it also raised disturbing questions. The bones were ancient, clearly from someone who had died years, perhaps decades earlier. They were not Nathaniel Burke's, that was clear. So whose were they? How many other people had disappeared in that region over the years without anyone properly investigating? How many other sets of bones would be hidden in the countless caves and remote valleys of Appalachia? When they returned to base camp that afternoon, Henry called another meeting. He explained the discovery and his intention to stop the expedition within 2 days. Not because he considered the mission complete, but because he had collected enough evidence to justify a much larger operation, one that would require resources that he simply didn't have there. He needed to return to Raleigh, present his findings to state, possibly even federal authorities, and organize an appropriate response. That could mean bringing in dozens of men, perhaps as many as 100, to systematically comb the entire mountain region. But not everyone agreed with Henry's decision. Edmund Calloway, who had been silent for most of the expedition since they found the warning at the stone shrine, finally voiced his opinion. He argued that waiting weeks or months to organize a larger expedition would give time for whoever inhabited those mountains to disappear completely or hide all the evidence. They had a chance now, with men and resources already in place, to find those responsible and possibly still find out what had happened to Nathaniel Burke and Ezra Whitlock. To wait would be to abandon the 2 men to their fate, assuming they were not already dead. The discussion went on for hours, getting more and more heated. Some men supported Edmund, especially those who had personal connections to the region and felt responsibility for the disappearances. Others agreed with Henry, arguing that they were ill-equipped and insufficient in number to confront an entire community that knew the terrain infinitely better than they did. Reverend Yates offered a different perspective, suggesting that perhaps they should try communication rather than confrontation, leaving messages offering peace and assurances that they had no hostile intentions. It was Robert Lee, the young soldier who had found Nathaniel's first piece of clothing, who brought out something that no one had fully considered. He wondered aloud if anyone had noticed that in all those days exploring the region, they had never really seen a single person. Only signs of human presence, empty shelters, objects left behind, written notices. It was as if whoever lived there was always one step ahead, watching them, deliberately avoiding them. What did that mean? Were there so few that they could not risk confrontation, or were there so many that they could afford to simply retreat and wait for the invaders to eventually leave? No one had an answer to these questions, and it was in this climate of uncertainty and increasing tension that the expedition spent its last planned night in those mountains. Henry had decided that they would return the next morning, regardless of Edmund's objections. He had legal authority as a special investigator appointed by the governor, and his decision would be final. Edmund accepted this with visible reluctance, but he accepted it. The men prepared for bed, some relieved at the prospect of finally getting down from that place, others frustrated that they left with no definitive answers. But the night had other plans. Around midnight, the night guards noticed something unusual: lights, small and faint ones such as flashlights or torches, moving through the forest around the camp. It wasn't just 1 or 2. There were dozens of them, forming a semicircle in the distance, all moving slowly toward the camp. The guards all woke up immediately. Within minutes, the expedition's 25 men were on their feet, armed, forming a defensive perimeter around the tents and fires. Henry picked up a megaphone he had brought exactly for communication situations and shouted in the darkness. He identified himself as a representative of the North Carolina government, said that they had no hostile intentions, that they were only seeking information about 2 missing men. He asked whoever was outside to come closer to talk, ensuring that no one would be harmed. His voice echoed through the valleys, reflecting off the rock walls, creating multiple layers of sound that gradually dissipated into the nighttime silence. There was no response. The lights kept approaching, slowly but steadily. Edmund suggested firing warning shots into the air, a show of force to discourage any attack, but Henry refused. They didn't know how many people were out there, nor their real intentions. One shot could start a confrontation that they were not sure they could win. Instead, he ordered everyone to keep their weapons ready, but pointed downwards, to feed the fires until they burned with maximum intensity, and to wait. If they were attacked, they would defend themselves. But they would not shoot first. The lights stopped approximately 100 meters from the perimeter of the camp. They stood there, motionless, forming a jagged line that stretched through the trees. The men of the expedition waited, tense, fingers on the triggers, eyes trying to penetrate the darkness beyond the reach of the fires, to discern shapes, numbers, anything that gave them a tactical advantage. Minutes passed like hours. The only sound was the crackling of flames and the controlled breathing of men prepared for violence. And then a voice came from the darkness. It was not shouted, but carried in such a way that it clearly reached the camp. It was the voice of a man, speaking English with a strange, archaic accent, as if using words and pronunciations from a previous century. The voice said only one sentence: "You have been told to leave." There was a pause, and then the voice continued. "The man of the city you are looking for is with his ancestors now. The guide who accompanied him had the wisdom to flee when there was still time. There will be no more warnings." And then, as abruptly as they started, the lights went out. All at once, the darkness of the forest swallowed everything again. Henry yelled again, asking the person to come back, to talk, to have some kind of agreement. But there was no response. The men waited in defensive formation until dawn, but nothing else happened. When daylight finally cleared enough to see, Henry and Edmund led a reconnaissance party to where the lights had been. They found footprints, many of them, on the wet ground. They also found remains of torches made with branches wrapped in fabric, soaked in something flammable, still slightly smoking. But no person. Whoever was there had completely disappeared into the forest, leaving only these minimal traces of his presence. The expedition descended from the mountains that same morning. There was no more debate about staying. Even Edmund agreed that the situation had become too dangerous. They had received a clear message. Nathaniel Burke was dead, and they should leave while they still could. The implication of the threat was unmistakable. It took them 2 days to return to Marshall, marching in compact formation, ever vigilant, but nothing followed them. It was as if, once they began to descend, those who inhabited the heights simply allowed them to leave. The arrival of the expedition to Marshall caused an immediate commotion. Half the city gathered to welcome them, eager for news. But the expression on the faces of the returning men did not promise good news. Henry Blackwood went straight to Judge Morrison's office, carrying with him all the evidence he had collected: the photographs, the carefully packaged human bones, the fragments of Nathaniel's clothing, his detailed notes. Edmund Calloway accompanied him, and together they spent the rest of that day and the entire night drafting a full report for state officials. The report, which would eventually make its way to the Capitol and be filed in North Carolina's official records, was an extraordinary document. Henry did not try to hide or minimize anything they had found. He described the symbols, the shrines, the shelters, the cave with the bones, and the final confrontation on the last night. Their official conclusion was that an isolated community, possibly composed of descendants of marginalized or outlying religious groups, inhabited the most remote regions of the Appalachian Mountains in Madison County. This community practiced rituals that included the use of human and animal remains, held territories that it violently defended against intruders, and was responsible for the disappearance of at least 2 people in recent times: Nathaniel Burke and Ezra Whitlock. Henry recommended a full military operation involving not only the state militia, but possibly federal troops. He estimated that it would take at least 200 men, adequate equipment for operations in mountainous terrain, and several months of planning to execute a systematic search that could actually locate and confront those living in the mountains. It also suggested that doctors and anthropologists be included in the expedition to properly document any finds and to deal humanely with anyone captured, especially if there were children or individuals who might be being held against their will. The report was sent to Raleigh by express mail, accompanied by the most disturbing photographs and a personal letter from Henry to Governor Kitchen explaining the urgency of the situation. The response took 3 weeks to arrive. When it finally arrived, it was deeply disappointing. The governor thanked Henry for his painstaking work, acknowledged the gravity of the findings, but informed him that there were no resources available in the state budget for an operation of the suggested magnitude. North Carolina was dealing with its own economic difficulties, and allocating hundreds of men and significant amounts of money to explore remote mountains was not politically feasible at that time. Instead, the governor suggested that Nathaniel Burke's case be officially declared an accidental expedition death with undetermined causes due to the impossibility of recovering the body. As for Ezra Whitlock, being a local resident who apparently fled of his own volition, there was no legal basis to continue investigating his whereabouts. The governor acknowledged that there were probably people living in isolation in those mountains, but pointed out that, technically, it was not a crime to choose to live apart from society, as long as there was no incontrovertible evidence of violent crimes against specific, identifiable individuals. Henry was furious at the answer. He had risked his life and the lives of other men, had meticulously documented evidence of criminal activity, and was now being told that nothing would be done. He considered making the case public, taking his story to the newspapers, creating popular pressure that would force government action. But Judge Morrison, an older and more prudent man, advised him against it. Making the case public could result in vigilantes and bounty hunters invading those mountains, causing unnecessary violence and possibly endangering innocent communities living near the remote areas. Reluctantly, Henry accepted that there was nothing more he could do through official channels. He remained in Marshall for 2 more weeks, interviewing older residents, collecting oral histories, trying to build a fuller understanding of the history of that region. What he discovered was fascinating and disturbing in equal measure. Several elderly people remembered stories their grandparents had told about the people of the heights, as they were called. They weren't considered dangerous if left alone, but there were unwritten rules that everyone respected. Certain trails weren't used, certain valleys were avoided, and any sign that someone wanted privacy was honored without question. One particularly elderly woman, who must have been at least 80 years old, told Henry something that he found especially revealing. She remembered when she was a child, perhaps in the year 1840-something, seeing a group of people coming down from the mountains to trade in the city. They brought animal skins, medicinal herbs, and beautifully crafted wooden artifacts. They spoke English, but with a strange accent and dressed in an old-fashioned way even for that time. They traded quickly, always in silence, never engaging in conversation beyond what was necessary for transactions, and then disappeared back into the mountains. This happened once or twice a year when she was young, but gradually became less frequent until it eventually stopped altogether. Henry wrote all of this down carefully. I was beginning to form a more complete theory. Perhaps these people were not violent criminals by nature, but simply a group that had chosen to live completely isolated and that reacted defensively when their privacy was invaded. Nathaniel Burke, in exploring his sacred or important sites, in collecting objects from the stone shrine, had crossed a line that he should not have crossed, and his fate served as a warning to others who might consider doing the same. It did not justify what had happened, but it offered a logic, a framework to understand. As for Ezra Whitlock, Henry never discovered his true destiny. The local guide simply disappeared and was never seen again in Marshall or any other town in the area. There were 2 possibilities. Either he had actually fled upon realizing the danger and started a new life somewhere far away, or he himself was somehow connected to those living in the mountains and had returned to them. Henry was suspicious of the latter. Ezra knew the trails too well. He knew where not to go. He tried to warn Nathaniel. Maybe he was an intermediary, someone who lived on the border between 2 worlds, and when that border was violated, he simply went back to the side where he really belonged. Henry Blackwood left Marshall at the end of August 1911. He returned to Raleigh and continued his work as a special investigator, but the case of Nathaniel Burke haunted him for the rest of his career. He kept all his files, all photographs, all notes, meticulously organized in boxes that were eventually donated to the state archives after his death in 1938. These documents remain there to this day, available to any researcher curious enough to look them up, a silent record of one of the strangest and most unsolved cases in North Carolina history. Edmund Calloway continued as sheriff of Madison County for another 15 years. He never organized expeditions to those mountains again. In fact, he became one of the most ardent advocates of leaving certain areas completely untouched. When young adventurers or explorers arrived in the city with intentions of mapping remote regions, Edmund steadfastly discouraged them, sometimes even exaggerating the natural dangers of the region to keep them at bay. He had seen something in those mountains that changed his perspective fundamentally. It was not just fear, but a kind of grudging respect for the will of a group of people to remain completely separate from the modern world. In the years following Nathaniel Burke's disappearance, there were occasionally other incidents. A hunter who did not return from an expedition in 1917, two college students who got lost during a hike in 1923 and were never found. Each time Edmund investigated to a certain extent, but he always came to the same conclusion. People had ventured where they shouldn't, and the mountains had taken them. He never again publicly mentioned the isolated community. That knowledge he kept to himself, sharing only with trusted successors and with those he thought needed to know for reasons of public safety. The railroad company that had hired Nathaniel Burke eventually gave up on its plans to expand lines through that particular region of Appalachia. Officially, the decision was justified by economic reasons and the difficulty of the terrain. But internal company documents, uncovered decades later by historians, suggest that the real reason was Nathaniel's disappearance and the alarming report that Henry Blackwood shared confidentially with company executives. It was simply not worth the risk of sending more men to an area where they could not guarantee their safety. The region remained without railroad development, without modern roads, essentially frozen in time as the rest of North Carolina moved into the 20th century. As the decades passed, the stories about Nathaniel Burke and what happened in that winter of 1911 gradually became local legend. Details were lost, others exaggerated, some completely invented. For some people, Nathaniel simply got lost and died from exposure. For others, he was attacked by wild animals. And for those who knew the darker versions of the story, he had stumbled upon secrets that the mountains jealously guarded, and he had paid the ultimate price for his curiosity. Each generation told the story slightly differently, but the core remained. There were places in those mountains where outsiders were not welcome, and grave consequences awaited those who ignored the warnings. Nathaniel Burke's diary eventually fell out of the possession of Madison County and was acquired by a private collector of historical documents in 1962. This collector, fascinated by history, tried to organize his own expedition to locate the sites mentioned in the pages of the diary. He gathered a group of 6 men, all experienced in mountaineering and exploration, and spent 2 weeks in the mountains during the summer of 1964. They found some of the general areas described by Nathaniel, but the specific landmarks had changed over more than 50 years. Landslides had altered the terrain, vegetation had grown and covered ancient structures, and they could not locate either the stone shrine or the cave with the bones. They also found no signs of recent human habitation. It was as if everything had been absorbed back into the forest. But something happened during that 1964 expedition that deserves mention. On the last night before they descended, camped in a valley that they believed was close to where Nathaniel had made his last camp, the collector and his companions heard something. It was not the sounds of confrontation that Henry Blackwood's expedition had experienced, but something more subtle: corners. Human voices singing in a language none of them recognized, echoing through the mountains, from a source it was impossible to pinpoint precisely. The sound lasted for perhaps 15 minutes, then dissipated into the night's silence. In the morning, when they came down, they all agreed not to mention it to anyone but themselves. But the collector noted in his personal diary, "There is something alive in these mountains besides animals and trees, something old that chose to remain hidden, and maybe it's better that way." In more recent years, with the advent of satellite technology and digital mapping, virtually every inch of the Earth's surface in the United States has been photographed and catalogued. Curious researchers occasionally scan images of the remote regions of Madison County, looking for anomalies, man-made structures, any sign that Nathaniel Burke's story had a foundation in tangible reality. Some claim to have found suspicious rock formations, clearings that appear to have intentional patterns, even what could be paths or trails connecting inaccessible areas. But satellite imagery can be misleading. Shadows look like structures. Natural formations mimic human design. and no one really knows what to look for. The truth is that that region of Appalachia remains, even today, one of the least populated and least developed areas of North Carolina. There are entire valleys where modern humans rarely tread, forests so dense that sunlight barely reaches the ground, caves that have never been fully explored or mapped. It's easy to imagine that something or someone could remain hidden there for generations if they really wanted to. The mountains are vast, and civilization, however advanced it has become, still occupies only the accessible margins and valleys, leaving the heights largely untouched. What really happened to Nathaniel Burke? Was he killed by an isolated community that saw his exploitation as desecration of sacred sites? Did he get lost and succumb to the elements, with his body eventually being discovered and ritualized by people who practiced customs we don't understand? Or is there a completely different explanation, something that neither Henry Blackwood nor Edmund Callaway nor any subsequent investigator has been able to conceive? More than a century later, we still don't have definitive answers, just fragments of evidence, second-hand testimonies, and that silent diary with its last unsettling entry about nocturnal footsteps. The case of Nathaniel Burke reminds us of something important about the nature of the United States in the early 20th century. As much as we like to think that the country was completely mapped, completely civilized, completely known at that time, the truth is that there were still blank spaces on the map. Places where the reach of the federal, state, or even local government simply did not reach in a meaningful way. Communities that lived lives completely separate from the main national narrative, following their own rules, maintaining their own traditions, protecting their own secrets with fervor that might seem fanatical to outsiders, but that made perfect sense within their own cultural logic. We, looking back across the distance of more than a century, can easily judge those who allowed the case to remain unsolved. Why didn't the governor send troops? Why did Edmund Callaway eventually stop looking? Why didn't Henry Blackwood insist more aggressively? But they lived in a different world, with different priorities and different understandings of what was possible or desirable. Perhaps they made decisions that, in that context, made sense. Or maybe they simply came across something that transcended their ability to cope properly and chose the path of least resistance. The Appalachian Mountains still stand as they always have, indifferent to the human dramas unfolding on their slopes and valleys. Trees grow, seasons change, streams continue to flow over ancient rocks, and somewhere in those heights, perhaps there are still descendants of those Nathaniel Burke found. Or maybe not. Perhaps time and the inevitable expansion of modern civilization finally caught up with them, and they dispersed, integrated, or simply ceased to exist as a distinct group. We don't know, and perhaps it is appropriate that we do not know. Some mysteries deserve to remain mysteries. Some stories deserve open endings that leave us wondering. What we can say for sure is that Nathaniel Burke, a 32-year-old cartographer from Richmond, set out in March of 1911 to map routes through Appalachia and never returned. His diary survived. His tools were found. Fragments of his clothes appeared in strange places.